Colin was approached by somebody dressed as a police officer who initially spoke to him about speeding, and he was placed into the back of the car. And I think then he very quickly realised that they weren't police officers. But at that point, Colin had been taken as a hostage.
The gang impersonating police attended his family home address. They spoke to his wife. They told her that Colin had been involved in an accident and she needed to come with them. There's no doubt Colin and his family feared for their lives. They were convinced they were not going to survive this.
When he got to the stronghold where he was interrogated, there were at least 5 men there who were masked and carrying firearms, and they were being aggressive, and they were pointing at his head whilst they were asking him questions about the depot. They took their time. They were actually in the depot for about an hour and a quarter, choosing what they wanted to take and what they didn't want to take.
It's been a day of high drama here in Kent. More than 100 police officers are involved in the investigation to find the armed gang that carried out Britain's biggest ever cash robbery.
I'd worked in Kent since 1991. I had no idea this place existed. It is, to all intensive purposes, a factory for moving and storing money.
It was a very nondescript building within an industrial estate that took money in from banks, supermarkets, financial establishments, where the money was counted, sorted. The money which could no longer be put into circulation was taken out for destruction. New notes from the Bank of England was sent there for distribution. And it really was just like a money warehouse.
Colin Dixon was the manager at the depot. He had a family and he lived away from the depot. He would try and vary his routes home. He was aware of the responsibility he had to himself and to his family, and he could possibly be a key to anybody wanting to get into that depot. The issue was, because of where he lived, there was one part of that route and that journey he had to take every single day. There was no compromising, he had to go. And that was the A249, which was Detling Hill.
He was travelling home when he saw blue lights behind him, and he was stopped by what he believed looked like a police vehicle. He was approached by somebody dressed as a police officer who initially spoke to him about speeding, and he was placed into the back of the car. And I think then he very quickly realised that they weren't police officers. But at that point, Colin had been taken as a hostage.
They took him to a rural area where they got him out of the vehicle and they placed him into a white van. And at this time they took his glasses off him and they taped his eyes down. And then he went on another journey. When he got to the stronghold where he was interrogated, there were at least 5 men there who were masked and carrying firearms.
The gang impersonating police attended his family home address. They spoke to his wife. They told her that Colin had been involved in an accident and she needed to come with them. She had their young child with her and got into the car, believing, again, it's a police vehicle and trusting it was police officers. But again, it was the gang, and brought them to a location to keep them under control as well.
Just to kind of make sure he understood how serious they were, they actually showed him his wife and child. So he knew that under no circumstances were they lying to him. They had his family.
They were convinced they were not going to survive this. He had a choice to make, and that choice was the lives of his family, or he helps the gang enter the facility covertly.
In the early hours of the morning, they put him in one of the vehicles that had been used for the kidnappings, and they drove him in convoy with a lorry and another vehicle. He was then persuaded to get out with a male dressed as a police officer and go to the door and get into the depot. And then once inside, the robber that went in with him took control of the control room of the depot. As soon as they got into the depot, they made their way to the department where all the people would have been, because they were all working in one room. They took control of them very quickly. They were showing firearms to them, Kalashnikov, assault rifle, pump-action shotgun, pistols, and the people knew straight away that something was afoot. But what confused them was their manager was there, and they didn't quite understand whether it was an exercise or it was a real thing. Very soon they realised it was a real thing, and they just complied with absolutely everything. They were all forced to lay on the floor. Their hands were cable tied behind their backs. Some of the cable ties that were applied so tightly that people lost the feeling in their hands, so there was no doubt to them that this was real. Robberies by nature are very fast and very dynamic. They get in and get out. This was different. The stakes for the robbers as well as everybody else were very high, and they took their time. They were actually in the depot for about an hour and a quarter, making sure they had all the correct cages. They even filled bags that they'd taken with them with money as well.
A 7.5-ton lorry had been reversed into a loading bay, and you could see from the CCTV that they were gradually loading cages of money. The lorry was starting to be weighed down. There was then some problem in the ramp of getting them in. They put the members of staff into the cages. The CCTV showed that as the lorry left, it clipped the edge of a barrier and broke one of the rear lights. That was another opportunity, because you are looking then for a vehicle that needs a repair, and it gives a line of inquiry to try and identify that vehicle.
One of the cages was damaged. Fortunately, the Dixon's child was put with that cage, and there was a space for the child to get out, who then managed to be directed by the others to get a key, and they were unlocked. They waited for 15, 20 minutes before they raised the alarm, because they just weren't sure whether they'd gone. They didn't want to risk the robbers come back in and start to shoot them.
The call that I'd had was there has been a huge tie-up robbery, which is a description we use to describe that type of offence where the offenders have contained or held the victims. So I knew roughly what it was, but it was described to me as a large amount of cash stolen.
When I arrived at the depot, there were a number of police vehicles there, marked police vehicles. The DI was there, and I thought, well, he's in charge. I'll pop over and have a chat to him. I understand there's much as maybe £1 million has gone. And he looked at me, he kind of cocked one eyebrow and said, more like 20.
When you get to the scene, and you know you are the person that's going to take control and charge, your first order is to get a really good briefing to understand from the staff that are already there what they have done, what they think's happened, witnesses, victims, offenders, what forensic opportunities have you got, all of the things that spin through your mind for any investigation. I knew this was a massive robbery, and what led to that robbery was on my mind more was the kidnap of a family, and the trauma that they had suffered was the thing that played on my mind. That was the thing I needed to get justice for, as much as finding the money and securing the money.
The first day, the Wednesday, the full day, we'd set up a call centre. We were trying to get out to the press, this is what's happened, we need help with this. There was a lot of press nationally and internationally asking us for information.
It's been a day of high drama here in Kent. More than 100 police officers are involved in the investigation to find the armed gang that carried out Britain's biggest ever cash robbery.
Interestingly enough, on that day, we did have a caller that was very persistent, and eventually they gave us a bit of information over the phone, which made us sit up and think, oh, you might know something.
There was some information from some of the victims and some of the CCTV as well that kind of indicated that maybe some of the gang had disguised their features in a fairly professional way. At one point, sort of Mission Impossible was mentioned. We then executed a warrant that led us to this particular location, and we seized a number of items.
As we're finishing, one of the guys says, look, we haven't searched the dustbins yet. And the dustbin men are coming down the road. The decision has got to be seize the whole bin, tape it shut to keep its integrity, throw it on the back of the van and seize it as one, and we'll search it at our leisure.
I had a 3 by 3 metre sheet on the floor I emptied everything out from each bag to go through it systematically and find what was in there. There was a lot of foodstuffs and rubbish in there as well, so all of that had to be picked out. And anything else of relevance, so including the latex sort of mock-ups, the receipts, envelopes, everything had been chopped up into tiny, tiny little fragments, and they were spread throughout the contents of the bin. So it wasn't just going through to see what I could find and see what was useful, it was also trying to find the tiny little fragments of each item and put them all together. It was a massive, complicated jigsaw puzzle, but it was about 10 jigsaw puzzles all kind of mixed in together.
From that, we did then subsequently get some DNA evidence that led to some of the suspects. So we were clear that the information about the sort of disguising of the gang was true, and that also then led us to other information that helped us identify other suspects. Those early days, you hardly saw home. I slept in the car a few times because I just snatched sleep here or there. I was considerably younger then, so physically you just get on with it. You find a way to make it work. You snatch sleep when you can.
That evening we got a phone call to an abandoned van at a pub called the Hook and Hatchet at Hucking, which is again off the 249, Detling Hill. We turned up and there was a red LDV van. It was the van in which Mrs. Dixon and her child had been kidnapped. Later in that evening, someone reported a fire. The fire brigade turned up to Burberry Lane in Leeds, Maidstone. They found 2 cars alight. One they managed to put out quite quickly, and they were a Vauxhall Vectra and a Volvo, and they were the 2 vehicles that had been involved in the kidnapping of Colin Dixon and his wife and child. The Volvo, very interestingly, had Colin Dixon's briefcase in the boot, and when we further examined the melted part of that car, we found bullets and a magazine to a Scorpion machine pistol melted into it. It's a bit of a fallacy that when you throw bullets into a fire, like in the Westerns, they all go shooting off everyone dives for cover. They actually do what's called cook off. They just get hotter and hotter, and then the bullet falls out of the end of the case.
We had information that the investigation had potentially identified where they'd been taken to as a family. The decision was made to take Lynn Dixon to that location, which we did in a van much like this. The world's press were at that location, so myself and Lynn Dixon were in the back of the van so that we couldn't be seen. And the irony is that's how she was transported in at the time of the offence. But when we got there, she got out, she was pointing out familiar features, and ultimately I asked her if it was the location, and she confirmed it was.
2 days into it, where I then had a phone call to say, can you join the inquiry, because the scale of what has occurred is becoming clear. At the start, there were probably around 100 officers and staff involved, with briefings 2 times a day, and it was dynamic. There was so much going on that we need to look at it and in effect split some of the business between us so it could be managed.
It's very unusual to have 2 DCIs working next to each other, is effectively sharing the role of senior investigating officer. It's just not normal. But this was such an extraordinary investigation, we realised really quickly it was going to be difficult for one person to do it, because over time we had a huge volume of covert information coming into us from all sorts of different sensitive tactics that we employed, as you can imagine, with such a large investigation, and that has to be managed in a very, very particular way. So you have to have a whole different team of people doing that. As an SIO, you just have to accept ultimately most of that information has to come to you at some point for you to make a decision on where is the real big priorities in what is just a sea of information. I don't think I did a single media interview until many months into it, and even then it was quite light. Mick Judge did a little bit more, but only very late into it, because the senior officers of the force recognised they needed to keep us focused on what our job was. Adrian Leppard did a phenomenal job of fronting the media for the force, and he was the face of the investigation.
These are callous criminals, they're professional criminals, they're an organised gang. We will catch these people.
It's important to remember a lot of those scenes, it wasn't just the cash that was found. There was obviously at times other things that were very helpful. Some of the firearms were recovered, fingerprint and DNA evidence at a lot of these scenes that helped us link people to those items or to the crime. It's quite surreal really to be found and say, right, there's a van found at a local hotel. it's got some shotguns in it and it's got a bag of money in it. And I remember saying, well, how much money? And there was a suitcase in there as well from memory. And it was sort of, well, how much money? And no one could tell me. I go, well, I know it's a lot of money. And there was a picture shown to me of a cop sort of holding and you see the size of what I can only describe as almost bigger than a tennis bag, I suppose, but that was clearly full. And this sort of cop almost struggling to hold it. These things just don't happen.
Initial check of it by one of our search advisors revealed that there was a couple of suitcases and a bag, and the bag he could clearly see in the top of it a balaclava, what looked like a bulletproof vest, and a Scorpion machine pistol. The balaclava had Lee Rush's DNA on the mouthpiece, and some of the false hair that had been found in the bin in South London from the hairdresser was inside the balaclava as well. So that gave us a good indication as to A, one of our robbers is Lee Rusher, and B, he's also one of the kidnappers as well.
When you've got something like this, you've got multiple scenes, multiple offenders. So you've got all of those, you've got all of their home addresses, you've got vehicles they might be using. So suddenly you're talking 50 plus scenes. Forensically, you can't use the same CSI from one scene to the next. They can't go between those scenes on the same day, even 2 days in succession. So you've got to juggle your staffing as well. So it was complicated.
Although Mr. Dixon was never declared a suspect, we were quite honest to say, and he realised there must have been some inside information, but we had to eliminate him because we knew, and we did warn him early on, that it would become a subject during any future trial. We had to be realistic about that.
In the early days, the world's press had descended around headquarters and we were still in that area with Mr. Dixon. It quickly became apparent we would need to move away, so we travelled away and spent time with the family at a separate location away from where the press was situated. And I remember on one day we were travelling on public transport, trying to remain incognito, and Mr. Dixon showed me the front page headline of, I think, The Sun, said, I think we've got a problem, and his picture was on the front of The Sun. Luckily it was a very old picture from a wedding, so nobody actually recognised him, but it was quite difficult to find somewhere where we could continue to get the evidence from Mr. Dixon without the press knowing where we were, but we managed it. It was very unusual, and we tried to divide up the day so that we would deal with evidence capture in segments, then allow the family to have lunch. We'd eat together sometimes, and sometimes we would give them time in the evening just as a family, but it was unusual to be watching the news with them when they were the headline on the news. At one point they asked us how their lives would change, and we were temperate at that stage because it was too early to say what was going to change, but it definitely dawned on them that they may not actually be going back to the life they had before.
When Colin Dixon was interrogated about the makeup of the depot and the security arrangements, he was taken into a building which he described as smelling strongly of paint, which turned out to be a workshop where he'd been held for some hours. But on that, he described being shown a drawing, and it was a drawing of the depot, and it was on a tarpaulin which was draped over a car. For the robbers to have that much information about the inside of the depot made it absolutely abundantly clear that there was an inside agent. Emir Husseini, who was an Albanian national, started to pop up a little bit too often. He was linked to other Albanian nationals. By this time, we knew of Jetmir Butchpapa, who by coincidence was an Albanian national. They were all living in the Tunbridge Wells area. It was starting to become a bit obvious. Emir Husseini had only started working at the depot in December of the previous year. So he'd only been there for 2 or 3 months. And on one occasion, he was at the depot. It was clearly apparent that his behaviour on this day was significantly different to any other day that he'd worked there.
Even in 2006, it was awash with CCTV. So it was very helpful in terms of identifying what had happened at the scene, but it didn't immediately help us identify who inside had been involved. And so we set about saying, well, let's work back and let's look and observe. The DCs involved did just an amazing job. How valuable it was, and their focus and their attention. And I can still remember the DC coming in to the briefing and, just huge excitement to go, I think I found them. Sat down with myself and Mick and some of the other team and said, right, watch. Saw this person just behave very, very bizarrely. And The more you watched it, the more obvious it became that they were filming, because they were walking up to doors and standing for a few seconds staring at a door rather than going through it, would then sometimes turn sort of 90 degrees and again stand for a few seconds. And of course, in a very, very busy factory with lots of people moving around at the time, no one genuinely noticed it because it was quite discreet how he did it. But in hindsight, of course, it was just superb for us in terms of an investigation, because it meant we were very, very confident then at that stage that this man was an inside agent.
Came to his meal break. He then got up, put his coat on, left the depot. When he came back, it was clearly apparent that his shirt had been pulled out and was now covering his belt, and he was far more relaxed and wasn't standing in front of doors. We found that his phone was pinging in the close proximity to those who we now knew were robbers. He came back into the depot, and all of the other people involved in that, of the gang, the robbery gang, then all disappeared to a premises near Maidstone where they were all pinging off the same mast. And at that time, Stuart Royal had a house at a place called Red Pits in Langley, and the mast that they were pinging off served that address.
The cages that had been used to remove the money were recovered on a farm. All of this is coming in at the same time as names. So when Lee Rush's house was searched, we were able to find drawings of the depot, which really also confirmed an inside agent.
We were searching in the bedroom. I found what I thought was a Walkman. People probably won't know what that is really, but a media centre with cables. And with searches, because you don't really know what things are, sometimes you just are on the side of caution that you think, actually, this could be something that could be linked to the robbery.
The footage we did get was clearly Russia and a female, and they were parked in the road where Colin Dixon and his family lived. And they were filming, and what had actually happened was they'd had this camera slipped into the strap of a handbag and the MP4 player placed inside, and the female then went and knocked on the Dixon's door, presumably to try and get images of Mrs. Dixon or anybody else in the house.
She didn't answer. 3 times I knocked on the window as well. Didn't want to do too much because I didn't want to be suspicious.
We knew it was Russia. We could hear his voice when they were getting it all set up. And we knew it was Butch Papa's VW Golf because it had a very distinctive crack in the windscreen all the way along from one side to the other. And it matched in the footage. So it was clearly his vehicle. And again, phone work showed us that Russia had gone up to the Herne Bay area near to the Dixon's address, and that's where he was pinging whilst his female colleague was trying to get an answer at the door.
This inquiry and this investigation, a lot of the results we got was really good police work, really good, focused detectives doing their job really, really well. But sometimes it was also just a little bit of luck or some, what I would describe as very, very basic errors by the gang. And a lot of it after the event. They really had not thought through how on earth do we manage this much money. In those sort of early weeks, we made a lot of arrests quickly, and that gave us some real advantages because it meant we captured evidence we might have lost if we'd have waited too long.
The ones we then had information on which we thought were robbers, such as Royal, Russia, Butch Papa, Coots, we had to try and find them first of all. For example, Russia and Butch Papa had disappeared. They weren't at their homes. They were aware that we'd executed warrants with firearms officers at their homes. They probably knew by now that we'd seized the Scorpion machine pistol, so we knew that they had been in possession of live firearms. That made them a danger, not only to the public, but to those that were about to arrest them. So every arrest of people we thought were robbers after that was done using a firearms team. Alan and Murray were aware of the arrests and they'd fled the country.
It's fair to say a lot of them were probably quite surprised that we'd got to them as quickly as we had. That gave us a big advantage. And of course, it's not just one interview. These are many interviews, sometimes over a period of time. Again, the staff involved in those suspect interviews worked really long hours and for a prolonged period of time.
Stuart Royal was a second-hand car dealer. He was arrested soon after the event in Tankerton with another male.
I remember getting the phone call to say, would I be available to come and interview him with another colleague. I don't know really what I was expecting, but it wasn't really Stuart Royal, if I'm honest. He just came across as an older gentleman who didn't really appear to know why he was there. There were many moments during the interview, to be honest, when I thought, I think you are the one, you are involved in this. But I do really remember one day he was up at the custody desk and was just sort of topping and tailing his interview. As he's walked down the corridor, I've just seen the back of him and he's got this particular gait, this walk. There is no doubt that he was one of the suspects.
Whilst examining the CCTV from the depot, it was clearly apparent there was a difference in heights and statures and builds of the robbers that had gone into the depot. You had the driver of the lorry that backed in. He was the only one who was quite portly and looked a bit older than everybody else. That turned out to be Stuart Royal. One of the others was a Mr. Average. Didn't appear to want to get too involved, but he was tying people up with cable ties. He fit the build completely of Roger Coutts. There was a guy who became known as Stopwatch. Once we got the name Lee Murray, he completely fit the build. There was another male called Hoodie, who was very big built, brandishing a pump-action shotgun. And we attributed Hoodie to being Paul Allen. And the two others were known as high vis, generally because the male wore a high visibility tabard during the robbery. We believed that to be Jetmir Butch Papa. Everybody that's spoken about Jetmir Butch Papa said that he spoke English, but it sounded like he was South African. And Mrs. Dixon was held at gunpoint in the rear of the lorry when she was taken to the depot. And the robber that held her at gunpoint was high vis and he had a South African accent. And the last one was generally the easiest, and he was known as Shorty. Lee Rusher is about 5'5", 5'6" tall, and was the shortest of all of them. We could see the mask that Shorty was wearing in the CCTV from the depot, and we could see that Shorty was carrying a Scorpion machine pistol. We find the balaclava on the Scorpion, and the balaclava's got Lee Rusher's DNA.
Probably searched 10 or 11 different premises over the course of a number of months. One in particular was Elderden Farm out near Staplehurst, and during a search there we were directed to head towards the orchard. Under a tree was a big black sack. We seized the money. There was £105,000 in there. Also, whilst searching at Elderden Farm, an identified bonfire patch in the garden, and we were then tasked to go and search that for between 2 and 3 weeks, searching this one spot, which was the bonfire. We had a bit of a production line of the searchers, and then we would use sieves to basically sieve the contents of this bonfire. And whilst sieving, I found what looked like a burnt mobile phone. So of course, anything that we were suspicious and thought might be linked, we would seize.
We received some information about a yard in Welling, a place called E&R Cars. With the assistance of the Met Police, we executed a warrant there, and we found a container at the back of the yard, like a shipping container. Parked in front of it was various vehicles, most notably a boat, a little speedboat called the Shaky Jakey, which belonged to Roger Coutts. Once we'd removed the boat and the vehicles away from the door, we opened it up, and inside we found a number of holdalls, and inside that was clearly money from the Securitas robbery. About £9.6 million in total in the end. In the actual workshop, which belonged to Coutts, we found £50,000 in a black bin liner, which had been hidden under one of the workbenches. So there was clearly starting to split bits and pieces up. Roger Coutts, who was a friend of Lee Murray's, was subsequently arrested and interviewed, and he was bailed whilst we did further inquiries as to how that money had got there, because obviously he may not have been the only person to have access to that. Later on, got some DNA off the cable ties in the depot that had been recovered, which was attributable to Coutts. He was arrested and subsequently charged.
For me personally, it's just the most staggering part of this whole inquiry. And I think it was Andy Nicol who came to see me and said, "You're not going to believe this." And I said, "Well, try me." And he said, "A man's just walked in and said, I've just found huge bags of money." To put that in context, you can imagine with this inquiry, we had so much information, and there were an awful lot of people telling us about where they'd seen money, or that money had been buried in their neighbour's garden. You know, I mean, we were awash with it, and a lot of it you realised was probably not true. So when he first described it to me, I said, okay, well, do we know anything about this man? Or is he a criminal? Do we think he's involved? What has he said? And Andy then told me the story. He owns a garage. He wanted to make a little bit of extra money, so decided to sublet the garage, which he had done to an individual who we now know is linked to the gang, and that he had twice chased up this individual to pay the rent on the garage, which I can't remember exactly, but it was something silly like £10 or £20 a week. And this hadn't been paid, so this man had thought, well, I'm not having that. Had gone down to the garage, opened it up, and found 2 huge bags of money. Huge. I'd love to know what had gone through his mind at that point, but I think he did the right thing. And came into us to say, look, this is what I found. And there was other items with the bags as well that was helpful to us, and clearly linked it back to the robbery. We recovered about £8 million.
There were obviously significant seizures both in Welling and in Southborough. And there, the actual size of the money, it was so large that it's quite a limiting factor for the people who had stolen it and then were looking to move it or contain it. So they had obviously done their work. They had managed to get the money out of the cash house. But thereafter, though they'd split the money up and we obviously made those recoveries, there was a lot of evidential material there that linked back to the cash house. You then had unique markings and bandings that were being created within the cash house from the money that was being moved, graded and sort of stored in the cash house. So you had 20s that were literally being run through the machine, and as they were coming out and being graded, that was producing a time band around that money, and that would show literally to the minute and the second that it was being processed. So we actually had some of those bands as the robbers were seen on the CCTV pictures. You could literally time the machines running to the time the robbers were in there.
Paul Allen and Lee Murray were friends from South London. They were both cage fighters, not really known to Kent Police, they were known to the Metropolitan Police, but both, when you looked at their history, they also had a link to Lee Rusher through cage fighting. We were able to show that Paul Allen and Lee Murray had travelled up to Derbyshire to purchase a belt, and it contained a camera for the inside agent. We were able to track their phones coming back down. It was interesting because when you looked at it, they were travelling by road, and then they seemed to deviate. And we later found that they'd actually been stopped by police in Nottingham, that their car had no insurance. The car was seized, and they then had to catch the train. So what the cell site then matched the train journey back down to Kent.
It's incredible, isn't it, how you just don't know where things that appear completely unconnected suddenly becomes very, very, very valuable. Once you get names, you can really start to focus on them as an individual, and very, very important that you try to build up a really broad picture of that individual as you can, because you just don't quite know what you're going to find. And another great example of detectives doing a really good job to really delve into Lee Murray's background and his history, and find something that then becomes relevant to us in terms of evidence. And, again, another really important piece of evidence in bringing him to justice.
Prior to the robbery, Lee Murray had hired a yellow Ferrari. The problem was Ferraris are powerful vehicles, and he had subsequently had a crash. Police had obviously been called because there was a bit of a dispute going on with the people he'd crashed into. He ended up getting arrested for an affray and taken into custody. We went and searched it. In it, we found an appointment card for a plastic surgeon. We found a photograph taken in a nightclub in southeast London, which had Murray, Allen, and a couple of others on it. Most importantly, on there were 2 mobile phones. We had them downloaded and we did some inquiries on them, and they became very, very significant phones. We had them DNA'd, Murray's DNA was on them. I got a phone call one Saturday morning from a DS over at Tunbridge. He said, you might want to listen to this. So I went over to see him on the Saturday morning. And it was 2 men, and it was a 5-minute recording, and they were discussing the depot. There's just absolutely no doubt they're discussing the depot.
I'm up till 4 or 5 in the morning thinking. Yeah, that might have just thinking. My head's thinking, a million routes.
You couldn't write that. that someone was discussing the robbery whilst inadvertently recording it on their own phone. It wasn't done on purpose. There's absolutely no doubt about that. You think, oh dear, it's obviously a new phone, and it was a new model Nokia, and it obviously pressed the wrong button whilst he was yapping to his mate about blagging the depot at Tunbridge. It was great.
You always want to get that first decision over the line. You know, the first time they say, we will authorise a charge on this individual is a very, very important moment in the inquiry, and a great relief for the inquiry team that have worked so hard to that point, because if we'd have done all that work and not brought anyone to justice, I think personally I'd have seen that as a failure on my part. I really would have done, and quite a difficult one to take maybe. But I think more importantly, my mind just keeps coming back to the victims. It's, you know, I'm not bringing people to justice for me. I'm doing it for them and the public. You know, the public need to have confidence in the police, and sometimes that's a very challenged and difficult thing. But I recognised how important this was to get people in front of a jury and let a jury of 12 people, good and true, make the decision about whether or not these people had committed these crimes.
We had 160 potential jurors. So the courtroom's filled with all these people who are thinking, what is going on here? Why is there so many of us? Because there's never that many normally. And then they've got a High Court judge telling them, you might be here for 6 months. Who can stay, who can't.
During this trial, the judge broke for 2 weeks to allow people to have a holiday, which I'd never come across before. But you've got to manage the whole of that trial, all of the evidence for that period of time. Although defence should warn us about certain disclosures, we don't know what they're going to say. Requests come in on a daily basis. So we even had a team that were working in the evenings back here. So following the court, if there were any issues raised, we had a team waiting to do that additional work.
It was interesting seeing them all together for the first time, because it wasn't just the 7 robbers in the dock. It was that everybody had their part to play in the puzzle. You know, from the minor to the major. I don't actually recall any of them really conversing to each other or looking at each other. And I was just looking at 8 ordinary people sat in a dock accused of horrible crimes, sort of thing. And I think your thought process goes, see, it could be anybody. Anybody can do anything.
Never been to the Old Bailey before, so just being able to sit in the body of the court was enough for me, and was an amazing experience. But then as we sat there, all of a sudden it was thrown on me by our QC, Sir John Nutting, that he was going to put me in the box as the first witness to take the jury through the jury bundles. So I think it's fair to say at that moment, my heart sort of disappeared slightly down into my stomach, and the nerves jumped in. But it was one of those things that you just had to dive in, and the adrenaline was pumping. But it was just a question of, this is really important, we just need to get in there. I'm going to be the first police officer from Kent Police that the jury are going to see and hear from.
I do remember it really vividly, suddenly walking into the courtroom when it's my turn and realising just how many people were present, because there was all of the defendants, they all had Queen's Counsel, as it was then, barristers, solicitors, reps, all sorts of people individually themselves, and then our prosecution team stood all on one side. And then by the time the jury came in, it felt to me like there was maybe 100 people in that courtroom. You can't help but feel very proud that you're there to represent, Kent Police and the job that you've done.
The judge obviously asked about the exhibit I found. First one was what I thought was a Walkman. CB12 was my exhibit, and they played it on the screen in there. And that was the first time I'd seen it. And I didn't know that it was actually the covert recce that had been completed by one of the girlfriends of one of the suspects. And then another exhibit was from Elderden Farm, and that was one of the mobile phones from the bonfire. Very unusual to be asked to actually open your own exhibit. So I did. They gave me scissors and gloves, and I sort of cut open the exhibit and tipped it out, forgetting obviously that it was absolutely caked in ash, which went all over the sort of stand where I was. But in there obviously was a burnt mobile phone, which they were interested in. And it just goes to show in searching, you don't know what you're seizing, what the relevance is going to be at the time.
We lost a member of the jury who had had an accident, and we lost a jury member who we felt we weren't happy with their interaction with the defendants, who was dismissed by the judge. We ended up with a 10-person jury at the end. So it wasn't without its challenges, shall we say.
It was a great feeling to know that all of the work that you'd done as an individual, but more importantly, the thousands and thousands of hours that you'd seen your colleagues put into this job, sometimes the most difficult, the most challenging, the surveillance work, the search work, the CSI work, the interviews, the trawling of CCTV, thousands of pieces of information from phone records that needed to be examined. All of that was coming together in ultimately what we wanted, which was justice. So it was a great feeling to know that you'd got to that point.
Tonight, after 7 long months, this particular Securitas trial, and there will be more, is at an end.
Lee Murray and Paul Allen were in Morocco. And at that time, we needed to make our contacts with the Moroccan authorities. But we also wanted to remain covert in what we were doing. We didn't want them to know in any way, shape or form. Because at that stage, we are building a case for extradition. And in effect, extradition means that we have sufficient evidence to bring a charge in this country and go to trial.
We spent a considerable period of time in Rabat, the capital, which is where they were, trying to sort of lay the groundwork for the Moroccans to assist us. At that time, it was quite difficult because it was recognised that Morocco didn't have an extradition treaty, and there were queries around the nationality for Murray. So there was a lot of legal requirements to be looked at and for evidence to be established as to whether we would be able to bring them back ultimately to the UK, or whether the Moroccans would conduct their own investigation on our behalf.
There's so many phases to this. So I had to go to the local magistrates court, which was Maidstone, and apply for an arrest warrant for Lee Murray and Paul Allen in Morocco. So I actually physically have to apply for that warrant and they have to sign it. Fortunately, they did.
The plan was for them to be arrested at the villa that they were staying in. We could not be involved because they were worried about violence that was going to take place. So we were actually dropped off at a very small sort of shopping centre close by to be picked up once the arrest had taken place. We had waited there when all of a sudden a kerfuffle of shouting, noises, banging, which to this day sounded like shooting, and I know that the tyres had been punctured. But what had happened was, on the way to arrest them, they were seen coming to the very shopping centre we were at to watch some football. There was absolute mayhem. The doors of the shopping centre open, people were running, screaming. Paul Allen, I have to say, was quite pleased to come back. When we risk assessed bringing him back into the UK and we made inquiries with airlines, it would have meant us actually booking seats all around. And we didn't get a lot of notice. So when you worked out the logistics of booking around 9 seats with officers to bring him back on a commercial flight, it was agreed that the best way forward was actually to actually hire a private jet. There were some concerns around security, so he was actually placed in a vehicle and put into a Chinook, which brought him back to our police headquarters and then into custody. I remember standing at Rabat Airport, watching him disappear as he took off on the ground in his Learjet and disappeared back to the UK with his police contingent. And we knew then we had got to the point where we'd been successful.
Lee Murray was eventually tried by a Moroccan judge. The Moroccan judge came to the UK. We briefed him on the circumstances and the evidence that we had, the case that we had. And he went back to Morocco and tried Lee Murray for those offences that we'd reported. And he was convicted. And he was initially given a 10-year sentence. which we thought was extremely low, bearing in mind the guys convicted in this country had got equivalent 30-year sentences. We were a bit disappointed, to be fair, because we knew there's a system in Morocco that anybody serving under 10 years could be eligible for a pardon for certain reasons within the Moroccan constitution. We thought that he might try and wriggle into that and just walk out of prison eventually, so he'd not really serve any time at all, especially if he'd still got some of the money from the robbery hidden away. He could use that to his own good fortune, if we put it that way. He then appealed the severity of his sentence, 10 years, because he obviously wanted to get under that threshold. And the only thing that was left to us to do was appeal the leniency, which we did. And then it all went all the way to the Moroccan Supreme Court. And we thought, oh, well, let's see where we go. And then one day we got a phone call saying, yeah, they've made their decision. This is what's happened. And we waited, and they came back to us and said, they agree with you. It was far too lenient, and they sentenced him to 25 years hard labour. His earliest release date is something like 2035.
I think I probably lost about 8 months of my life in one way, because this did take over my life. But during that period, you found the moments you could to spend time with your family and friends, to perhaps just renormalise. And then also, you're not performing to the very best of your ability if you're immersed in something for that long, and you're not giving your brain a chance to kind of just relax and forget about work for a while. Your time with your family gets really, really squeezed. Describing how you support people through a long period of time, it was no different for me. I had to find ways of doing it, and there are sometimes helpful reminders from your family. So my daughter Abby would have been 5 or 6 at the time. I think she would have been in fact just turning 5 in the March. I used to try and spend as much time as I could with her and her brother, and I sat down with her, I think, one Sunday morning, and she just suddenly looked at me and said, when am I going to see you for a long time, Daddy? Of course, that hits you a bit, because you're like, right, that's a difficult question. She is seeing me, but it's all in small snippets. I'm like the trailer to the film. I'm there for 5 minutes. I give her a little bit of time where I can. And a lot of our routine, whereas if I could get home in time, sometimes I'd read her a bedtime story. The weekends I tried to preserve as much as I could, so we would go out. All of that had stopped, and it had stopped for quite a long period of time. And of course, you don't sometimes stop to think, and that made me stop and think.
It's a great privilege to be involved, but because it's such an investigation, and certainly when I was seconded to Maidstone, there was a team of 4 of us, and we were working 6 days a week and at least 15 hours a day. It included for me an hour's travelling there and back. The day off that you have, you tend to be asleep because you've been working so hard. You put that to one side because there are victims in this case that you want to get those answers for.
It's a huge investigation in the history of the force, it really is. And they don't come along every day, not of this scale, but it does feel like yesterday in many ways.
It still remains the largest cash robbery in the UK, £53 million. It is of an interest. I mean, it was an audacious robbery. People are still serving jail sentences for it.
It was all-consuming, there's no doubt about that. I'd been working on one case from February the 22nd, 2006, and I was still working on it well into late 2009, over 3 years on one case, just one case, nothing else. We made a significant amount of arrests, examined 359 mobile telephones. We had evidentially 40,000 lines of telephone data, 14,500 exhibits, nearly 5,000 statements. We had 62,000 pieces of unused material. And we did something like 1,100,000,000 fingerprint comparisons. Ironically, we spent £5.3 million investigating it.
I'm left now holding the investigation in terms of day-to-day contact. We still get people phoning in or sending in messages in relation to bits of money or bits of information about the people involved. The planning that went into this, the firearms that were used, the lengths that they went to, they were prepared to do anything to carry out their plans. And I often think it's more luck than judgment that something didn't go very wrong and someone didn't end up being seriously harmed or even killed.
I've been in and out of that Tunbridge cash house a number of times in the period as part of the investigation, and spoke to members of the staff there. They may not have been members of the staff who were on the duty that particular night, but the ripple out effect to them, breaking trust that they had both in what they thought was pretty much an impregnable building and being able to work in that environment untouched had really gone. There were some very traumatised people out there, above and beyond those that the robbers put their hands on or put in some really quite horrible situations. There were true victims there. It's a testament that we were able to get the results we were for them.
I often reflect now about how they're doing and where they are, and obviously it's 20 years since I last saw them, so we did have quite a unique time together, them in the aftermath of something that changed the course of their life, and for me, probably one of the most significant parts of my career.
I often think about the victims. I've had interaction with Mr. Dixon following it and chatted to him, and I think they've been looked after. The others in the depot, I do know that they suffered flashbacks and fear of the dark even, stuff like that, not knowing what's going to happen, and it affected some of them severely. Remember the people that were just going about their lives trying to make an honest living, and how they've been affected and how their lives have been ruined by greed.
We chased some money out to northern Cyprus. Jetmir Butch Papa was Albanian. There was a thought that money went there. We did trace money out to Dubai, but it disappears. I don't think there's money sitting around anywhere. And if you did, the denominations are out of circulation.
I'll go back to 2006, and the chief at the time, Mike Fuller, made it clear that we would not stop our search for the suspects or to recover the cash. So we haven't. Of course, 20 years on, your opportunities to find cash or find people naturally will be reduced. But it does not mean that we stop. We won't stop. We've still got staff that will look at any information and intelligence that comes in. And that commitment, I have to honour that as the chief today, and so we do. I know there are still suspects out there that we haven't caught. We're not going to stop looking for them.